Hey guys, it's the Tominator, and in this one I wanted to discuss the greatest bodybuilders ever, which is something I've already done before in a couple past videos, one very recently in fact. The difference this time around is that we're going to go through it on a decade by decade basis. Alright, so in most cases, as you'll see, the choice is pretty obvious, so that's why I'm going to also throw in a runner-up, and sometimes even a third place guy for the more competitive eras. So we're going to start this off in the 60s. I realize bodybuilding goes back further than that, but the thing is that my channel focuses on the IFBB, and since the Mr. Olympia contest wasn't even introduced until the mid-1960s, I'm honestly just not that well versed in anything before then. Maybe someone like the Golden Era Bookworm would be more qualified to talk about this, but anyway, the best bodybuilder of the 60s was undoubtedly Sergio Oliva Sr. He was just so far ahead of his time. In a way, this was like the precursor to a 1993 Dorian Yates, in the sense that here's some guy who just took the game to the next level and blew people away with an unprecedented level of muscle mass. Oliva was so dominant at his first Olympia victory in 1967 that his competitors didn't even bother showing up to challenge him the next year, and he won unopposed in 68. I praised Sergio many times before, including crowning him the most genetically gifted bodybuilder to ever live, so that right there really says it all. After Oliva, you'd probably have to go with Larry Scott in runner-up. He was, of course, the original Mr. Olympia in 1965, and repeated the feat the following year. Larry was also pretty blessed himself, especially in the arm department with those amazing biceps and forearms. So that's it for the 60s. As for the 70s, I think we all know the answer already. Arnold Schwarzenegger. I mean, come on, this one needs no explaining. The man won 6 Olympia titles during this period, and to this day remains arguably the greatest bodybuilder in history. With a timeless physique, including some of the best biceps and pecs ever, plus an unparalleled impact and legacy, Arnold takes the cake here, and it's not even close. In second place, I'd have to go with Frank Zane. Franco Columbu is also in contention, and there were other legends to consider like Lou Ferrigno and Serge Nubret, but ultimately 3-time Mr. Olympia Frank Zane won more titles and proved to be more influential, at least in my opinion. If there's a third place here though, it would have to go to Franco, the only other Mr. Olympia of the decade. If Frank Zane was the spiritual forefather to classic physique, then Franco was the equivalent for the 212 division. In the 80s, it's again a pretty straightforward decision. Lee Haney captured 6 of his 8 Sandow trophies during this period, completely owning the latter half of the decade. Even though there were other champions between him and Schwarzenegger, Haney was Arnold's rightful heir in my eyes, the natural evolution of the dominant big man with awesome aesthetics. After Haney, it gets a bit controversial. Personally, I would go with Rich Gaspari, believe it or not. While he never managed to actually win the Olympia, Rich did place second 3 times in a row from 1986 to 88. He also revolutionized the sport by being the first to show striated glutes on stage and bring that hard, grainy type of conditioning that's so highly coveted today. Without Rich, it's questionable whether we'd have ever seen a Dorian Yates or the Branch Warrens of the world. And if we're awarding a third place, my vote would go to Tom Platz. Again, he never became Mr. Olympia, but he took the lower body to a whole new level. He showed what was possible for leg development, and to this day built probably the greatest, most balanced pair of wheels we've ever seen. Now, of course, Samir Bannout needs to be mentioned. He looked spectacular when he won in 1983, and it could even be said that he represented for back development what Platz did for legs. My problem with Bannout is that he was inconsistent, okay? Even something of a one-hit wonder. That's why I put Gaspari and Platz above him here, but this is pretty subjective at the end of the day. As for the 90s, this one is trickier, but it's really not. Now, he's not my favorite bodybuilder by any stretch of the imagination, but you have to admit, Dorian Yates ruled this decade. Like Arnold and Haney before him, Yates claimed bodybuilding's most prestigious title 6 times, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt, no pun intended, that it was no fluke. His wicked 1-2 punch of mass and conditioning, Plus, his devastating efficiency in the mandatory comparisons was simply too much for his more genetically gifted opponents to overcome. After Dorian is where it gets interesting. So after much deliberation, I'd have to go with Flex Wheeler. Flex took runner-up 3 times and claimed 3 Arnold Classic titles during this period. This is objectively better than what Kevin Levrone managed to accomplish during the 90s, with 2 Arnold Classics and 2 Olympia runner-ups. Plus, on a subjective level, I just feel that Flex had the better physique. It's tough to top what he brought back in '93. For the bronze medal, I'm going to go with my boy Sean Ray. Sean was the most consistent bodybuilder of the 90s, competing all the way through from 1990 to '99 and never falling outside the top 5. He finished second to Dorian twice and also collected 2 Arnold Classics in 1990 and '91, although he was technically stripped of the second due to some drug testing nonsense. And for all the Levrone fans out there, for what it's worth, he'd be my pick for 4th, hands down. And in any other decade, he's easily cracking the top 2 or 3, but the 90s was just so stacked. In the 2000s, it's again a little controversial, because on the one hand, Jay Cutler was the most consistent by far, placing either 1st or 2nd for 8 out of the 10 years, and racking up 3 consecutive Arnold Classics between 2002 and 2004, so it's hard to argue with that. But then again, Ronnie won 6 Olympia titles, running away with the first half of the decade, before basically falling apart and retiring in 2007. So who do you go with here? Well, I would say that Olympia wins are the most important thing, so Ronnie's got to take it. Cutler's a very close second, though. After that, you got to go with Dexter Jackson, the only other man to win the Mr. O during the 2000s, and definitely the most consistent competitor in terms of placings after Jay. Once we get to the 2010s, we see a return to singular dominance in the form of Phil Heath. Now, love him or hate him, he was simply head and shoulders above most of his competition from a purely bodybuilding perspective, and it's not surprising that he won 7 Sandows in a row. Kai Greene is second. Even though he essentially gave up on bodybuilding after failing to dethrone Phil time and time again, what he accomplished in the first half of the decade is enough to establish him as the next in line. 3 Olympia runner-ups between 2012 and 2014, and 2 Arnold Classics, 3 overall, but the first came in 2009, so it isn't counted here. That's more than anyone else can claim. Sure, Sean Roden and Brandon Curry won the Olympia where he didn't, but Curry did so with Roden and Phil out of the picture, while Roden never won an Arnold Classic and only had 1 second place, but was never able to push the better versions of Phil like how Kai did. I would probably still put Roden in 3rd, although there is an argument for Dexter once again as well. So, those are my picks for the best bodybuilders of each decade, which brings us to this point. Who will reign supreme in the 2020s? Only time will tell. At the moment, it's impossible to say, as it's the first time in decades that there is no heir apparent, nobody to point to and say, aha, that's the next Mr. Olympia. As a result, I suspect we'll see the title changing hands fairly often in the foreseeable future. Hopefully someone of the caliber of a Phil Heath or Ronnie Coleman will come along again, but I don't see it happening in the next 4 or 5 years at least. Alright, thanks for watching everyone, hope you enjoyed. Keep in mind that this video wasn't using any rigorous metrics like I did for, say, ranking the GOATs of bodybuilding. Here we were taking more of an intuitive approach, okay? Looking at this stuff at more of a high level. For the most part, I think the number ones were rather clear-cut and not really debatable, but you can let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more, and until next time, this has been the Tominator signing off, and I'll be back.